It all started on an ordinary weekday, back when I was just a kid. I grew up in Nebraska, surrounded by endless farmland, where the wind carried whispers through the towering stalks of corn. My parents were always working, so I had to bike to school alone. It wasn't a big deal. The route was straightforward. Follow the main road and pedal past a sprawling cornfield that seemed to stretch forever. My parents had one rule, though, and they never let me forget it. Don't cut through the cornfield. They warned me about how easy it was to lose your sense of direction in there. Without a phone, they said, I could end up wandering for hours. I took their warning seriously. Every day I stuck to the road, even if it meant taking the long way home. That day, however, something went wrong. My bike chain slipped off just as I was halfway home. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands fumbling with the greasy chain. No matter what I tried, it wouldn't budge. My dad had shown me how to fix it, but for some reason, it was like the bike was determined not to cooperate. I looked at the road ahead. Walking all the way home with my bike dragging beside me, it felt like an eternity. That's when I glanced at the cornfield. It loomed on my left, the stalks swaying slightly in the breeze. From where I stood, it looked peaceful, almost inviting. If I just walked straight through, I'd save so much time. How hard could it be? I hesitated. My parents' warnings echoed in my mind. But as I wiped my sweaty hands on my jeans, the thought of the shortcut was too tempting. I told myself it would be fine. All I had to do was stay in a straight line. At first, it was easy. I found a narrow path between the rows of corn and started pushing my bike along. The stalks were tall, towering above me, but there was just enough space to move. A soft rustling surrounded me, and the air felt cooler inside the field. It wasn't so bad, but after a few minutes, the mood began to change. The light dimmed as the corn seemed to close in around me. The narrow path I'd found grew tighter, and the rustling sounds grew louder, too loud to be just the wind. I told myself it was fine, but every so often I found myself glancing over my shoulder. No one was there, yet the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave me. Then I heard it, a faint rustle not far off to my right. I froze, clutching the handlebars of my bike. My breath caught in my throat. I strained to listen, telling myself it was probably just an animal, a bird, maybe a raccoon. But deep down, I knew it wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. The rustling stopped. For a moment, I thought I imagined it, but as soon as I started moving again, it came back, closer this time. The sound was deliberate, as if something or someone was following me. My pulse quickened, and I tried to walk faster, though dragging the bike slowed me down. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. I was just a kid, right? My imagination was running wild, but the sound wouldn't stop. It followed me, matching my pace. Whenever I paused, it paused too. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. And then I saw him. I turned a corner in the narrow path, and there he was. A man standing perfectly still in the middle of the row ahead of me. He didn't belong there. He wasn't a farmer, and he didn't look like he lived nearby. His clothes were filthy, torn in places, and long scratches crisscrossed his arms. His face was pale, gaunt, like he hadn't seen the sun in years. "Are you lost?" he asked in a voice so low and raspy, it barely sounded human. I couldn't answer. My feet were rooted to the ground, my heart pounding in my ears. He took a step toward me, extending his hand. "I can help you," he said, his voice growing louder, more insistent. "I'll take you home." That's when my instincts finally kicked in. I dropped my bike and ran. I didn't look back, but I could hear him crashing through the corn behind me, his voice shouting, "Stop! I just want to help." I sprinted as fast as I could, weaving through the stalks, my legs burning and my chest heaving. The cornfield seemed endless now, every row identical, every turn leading nowhere. At one point, I dove into a patch of stalks and crouched low, hugging my knees, trying to make myself as small as possible. My whole body was trembling. I held my breath as the rustling came closer. I could hear him muttering to himself, something about finding me, about not letting me go. And then he stopped. The rustling faded, and I sat there, frozen for what felt like hours. When I finally gathered the courage to move, the sun was dipping low on the horizon. I stumbled my way out of the cornfield, shaking and terrified. until I saw the familiar shape of my house in the distance. When I burst through the door, my parents were frantic. I tried to tell them what had happened, but the words wouldn't come out. My dad grabbed a flashlight and went out to look for my bike, but it was gone. Whoever that man was, he'd taken it, or worse, he was still out there. A few weeks later, something happened that made my family leave the house for good. One afternoon, I came home from school and there it was, my old bike, sitting on our front porch, clean, polished, with not a scratch on it. We packed our things and moved the next day. I've never been back to Nebraska. I don't know who that man was or why he was in the cornfield that day, but sometimes I still hear his voice in my nightmares. I'll find you. When I moved back to my parents' farm, I thought I was leaving my failures behind. I was in my late 20s, and the dreams I had of becoming a writer had fizzled out. Life in the city hadn't worked out the way I planned, and returning to Nebraska felt like starting over. The farm was a place of quiet, of routine, and maybe even a second chance to find some direction. At least that's what I told myself. My parents were getting older, and the farm had become too much for them to manage alone. I convinced myself that helping them out was the right thing to do. But deep down, I wondered if I was just running from my problems. The days were simple, tending to the fields, fixing what was broken, and making sure the livestock were cared for. Nights, however, were my own. I'd sit by my laptop in the small attic room I'd claimed as mine, trying to recapture the spark of creativity that had driven me years ago. It was from that attic window that I first saw him. The field stretched out endlessly in every direction, rows upon rows of corn swaying gently in the evening breeze. It was peaceful, in a way I'd forgotten living in the city. But one night, just as the sun was setting, I noticed something strange at the far edge of the field. A figure stood there motionless, between two rows of corn. At first I thought it was a shadow, just a trick of the fading light. But no, it was a person. I squinted, trying to make out more details, but they didn't move. They just stood there facing the house, or at least that's how it seemed. I called out to my parents about it during dinner that night, half expecting my dad to dismiss it as nothing, but instead he shrugged. "Probably just someone from the neighbor's place," he said, "checking the crops or something." That explanation felt off. The neighbor lived over a mile away, and the figure wasn't walking or working. They were just standing there, watching. The next night I saw them again. Same spot, same stillness. By the third night, it was undeniable. This wasn't just someone passing through. They were there every evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon. They never came closer, never moved, just stood, like a scarecrow frozen in place. I started to get curious, or maybe it was the writer in me, desperate for a story. One evening, I grabbed my dad's old binoculars from the shed and waited by the attic window. Sure enough, the figure appeared right on time. Through the binoculars, I could see it more clearly. A tall man, his features obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. His clothes were dark and loose-fitting, almost blending into the corn around him. He didn't look like any farmer I'd ever seen. I kept telling myself it wasn't a big deal. Just some eccentric neighbor, maybe even the local kid my mom called odd but harmless. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Why stand there night after night without doing anything? Why never approach the house or speak to anyone? On the fifth night, he was closer. It wasn't obvious at first, but when I compared his position to the previous evenings, I realized he had moved about 20 feet into the field. My chest tightened. Was he testing the boundaries? Was he coming closer? I decided it was time to act. The next morning, I told my parents about the figure and how he seemed to be creeping closer every night. My mom brushed it off, claiming it was probably nothing. "Just let him be," she said, with a kind of casual dismissal that made me want to scream. My dad, on the other hand, looked thoughtful. "If he comes closer, we'll deal with it," he said. That was it. No urgency, no concern. That night, I didn't wait for the figure to show up. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the edge of the field just before dusk. The rows of corn seemed taller up close, almost menacing. I stood there scanning the horizon, waiting. The light began to fade and the field grew quieter. The only sound was the rustling of the stalks in the breeze. And then I saw him. He was standing farther into the field now, closer than ever before. My flashlight beam caught him for a moment, illuminating his face, or rather the lack of one. His features were obscured, blurred by shadow, but I could feel his gaze fixed on me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky despite my effort to sound confident. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. It was as if he were waiting for something. I stepped closer, gripping the flashlight tighter. "This is private property," I shouted. "You need to leave." That's when he turned, not toward me, but back into the field. He moved with a strange, fluid motion, vanishing between the rows before I could take another step. Without thinking, I followed him, the flashlight beam bouncing as I jogged into the corn. The stalks closed in around me, the world narrowing to the tunnel of light from my flashlight. The figure was just ahead, always just out of reach. My heart pounded as I pushed forward, convinced I could catch him, confront him. But no matter how fast I moved, he stayed the same distance away. Then I heard it, a low guttural sound, like a growl rising from somewhere deep within the field. I froze, scanning the corn with my light. The figure was gone, but the sound was growing louder, closer. The rustling of the stalks became frantic, as if the field itself were alive. Panic took over. I turned and ran, crashing through the rows until I burst out onto open ground. I didn't stop until I was back at the house, slamming the door behind me. My parents stared at me, confused and alarmed, as I tried to explain what had happened. The next morning, I went to the neighbor's farm to ask if they'd seen anything strange. The elderly woman who lived there shook her head. "I don't go out after dark," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But if you're seeing someone out there, it's not anyone from around here." That was the last straw. I told my parents we needed to call the police, but they hesitated. "What are we going to tell them?" my dad asked. "That some guy likes standing in our field?" That night I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing the figure, the way he moved, the growling sound that came from the corn. I stayed up watching from the attic window, but he didn't appear. For the first time in days, the edge of the field was empty. It wasn't until the next morning that I realized something was wrong. The corn at the far edge of the field had been trampled, the stalks flattened in a perfect circle. At the center of the circle was a single dark object. I stepped closer, heart pounding, and found a hat, wide-brimmed, dark, and unmistakable. I left the farm 2 weeks later. My parents insisted they'd be fine, but I couldn't stay. To this day, I don't know who or what that man was. But sometimes when the wind rustles through the trees outside my window, I swear I can still hear the corn whispering his name. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to leave the noise of the city behind and embrace a quieter life. When I found the small, weathered house at the edge of a rural town in Iowa, it felt perfect. Cheap rent, lots of space, and no neighbors for miles. The property was surrounded by acres of farmland, but the feature that stood out most was the sprawling cornfield that brushed right up against the backyard fence. It was almost picturesque, the way the stalks swayed gently in the wind like waves on a green sea. But from the very first night, I couldn't shake an odd feeling about the place. The kind of feeling you can't explain, just a vague sense that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't until October, when the nights started to turn colder, that the unease turned into something more. I was standing on the back deck, smoking a cigarette and enjoying the crisp night air. The wind was brisk, rattling the stalks of corn like dry bones. My breath fogged up in front of me as I stared out at the field, lost in thought. That's when I heard it, a scream. It wasn't an animal. No, this was different, sharp, high-pitched, unmistakably human. It sounded like a child, a boy, yelling from somewhere deep within the corn. My chest tightened, and without thinking, I ran inside to grab my rifle and a flashlight. There was no way I could ignore a sound like that. A child could be lost, hurt, or worse. As I climbed over the low fence and stepped into the field, I shouted, "Hey, are you okay? Where are you?" Nothing. The silence that followed was suffocating. The only sounds were the rustling of the corn and the crunch of dry earth beneath my boots. I pushed forward, my flashlight cutting narrow paths through the dense stalks. The field seemed endless, every row identical to the last. But I kept going, calling out every few steps. Then I heard it again. The same scream, louder this time, coming from somewhere ahead of me. My heart raced as I picked up my pace, the flashlight shaking in my hand. "I'm coming!" I shouted, hoping whoever it was could hear me. But as I moved deeper into the field, something changed. The air felt heavier, the darkness thicker, like the corn was closing in around me. And that's when I realized something that made my blood run cold. The scream wasn't moving. It was always in the same spot, no matter how far I walked. I stopped in my tracks, the beam of my flashlight bouncing off the endless rows of corn. "Hello!" My voice trembled. "Are you there?" No response. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the scream stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. My grip tightened on the rifle as I turned in a slow circle, trying to make sense of where I was. That's when I heard a new sound. Soft, deliberate footsteps crunching through the dirt. They were close, impossibly close, but I couldn't see anything through the thick stalks. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "This isn't funny." The footsteps stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Then out of nowhere, something darted past me, brushing against the corn and vanishing into the darkness. My flashlight swung wildly, but there was nothing. Just the endless sea of green and black. That was enough for me. I turned and ran, crashing through the stalks as fast as I could. The rows blurred together, the field disorienting and alien. The flashlight barely helped. Every direction looked the same. My pulse was pounding in my ears when I finally broke through the edge of the field and stumbled back into my yard. I leaned against the fence, struggling to catch my breath, when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The back door to my house was open. I knew I had shut it before I went into the field. I raised the rifle and crept toward the house, my boots crunching on the gravel path. "Whoever's in there, you better come out now," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. No response. The kitchen was the first thing I saw when I stepped inside. It was wrecked. Cabinet doors hung open, dishes were shattered on the floor, and the fridge had been pulled slightly out of place. It was like a tornado had torn through. Then I noticed the footprints. Muddy prints, small and bare, leading from the door to the staircase. They were too small to belong to an adult. My breath caught in my throat as I followed them, rifle raised, my hands trembling. The trail led to the second-floor hallway, stopping just outside my bedroom door. The door was ajar, creaking softly in the breeze from the open window inside. I pushed it open slowly, my flashlight cutting through the dark. The room was empty, but on the bed, in the exact center of the mattress, was something that shouldn't have been there. A child's shoe. Small, muddy, and completely out of place. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with every light in the house turned on, the rifle across my lap. I kept expecting to hear the scream again, or the footsteps, or anything at all. But the night passed in silence. The next morning, I called the local sheriff's office. They sent someone out to look around, but there wasn't much they could do. No signs of forced entry, no missing children reported in the area. They chalked it up to a prank or my imagination. But I knew better. I'd heard the scream, I'd seen the footprints. And that shoe, it wasn't mine. I should have packed up and left right then. But part of me didn't want to give in. I told myself it was a one-time thing, that it wouldn't happen again. For a while, I was right. Days turned into weeks, and everything seemed normal. I almost convinced myself it had been some bizarre, explainable incident. Then came the fire. I was upstairs brushing my teeth when a flicker of orange light caught my eye. I turned to the window and froze. Flames were licking up from the edge of the cornfield, small but growing fast. My chest tightened as I ran down the stairs, grabbing the garden hose on my way out the back door. I sprayed the flames as fast as I could, the water soaking through my clothes. The fire didn't spread far, and after a few frantic minutes, I managed to put it out. But as the smoke cleared and the field returned to silence, I noticed something that sent chills down my spine. Someone was standing at the edge of the field, just barely visible in the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark figure watching me. When I took a step toward them, they disappeared into the corn without a sound. That was the final straw. I packed my things the next morning and left. I didn't tell the landlord why. I didn't even care about getting my deposit back. I just knew I couldn't stay another night in that house. Even now, months later, I can still hear the scream in my dreams. And every time I see a cornfield, I can't help but wonder what's hiding in the darkness. Waiting, watching,